Good evening. We are thrilled to have you here this evening. Thank you so much for coming and for participating in the Six Bridges Book Festival and for being here this evening for this session. So my name is Karama Neal. I'm going to be the moderator this evening, and I want to start by first thanking our sponsors that have made this evening possible. First, the Rebsamen Fund, who has been a longtime supporter of the Six Bridges Book Festival. I want to thank them. I think there are representatives from each of these who are here today. The Alan Ross Cumpy Memorial Fund. I want to spend a little bit of time here. Alan Ross Cumpy tragically died 35 years ago, way too young, and his loving family created this fund, the Alan Ross Cumpy Memorial Fund, to honor his memory and to spread a love for something that he loved, birding. So in addition to supporting this program tonight, the Alan Ross Cumpy Fund created a birding area at the Fletcher Branch Library, and they also purchased birding kits that can be checked out. And so there are staff on hand tonight who can tell you more about those birding kits, who can tell you how to check them out. And I'm sure, because I've been spending a little bit of time with our speaker this evening, I'm sure you will be inspired to either become a birder or become a better birder after this evening. And so you will definitely want to check out one of those kits so that you can use those to enjoy birds. Finally, I want to thank the Wild Birds Unlimited because they donate seed to the Fletcher Library, to that birding area, to make sure that it is always full of birds. And so, again, thank you to those sponsors. As I mentioned, there are representatives here, and so we are grateful to you for your support of this work. Indeed, thank you. So now I'd like to introduce our guest of the evening, and I'll keep it brief because we want to hear from him. I hope you will join me in welcoming science writer, comics writer, New York City Audubon board member, host of National Geographic's Extraordinary Birder, and author of Better Living Through Birding, Notes from a Black Man in the Natural World, Christian Cooper. Please join me in welcoming him.
Hi, everybody, and thank you for the warm welcome to Little Rock. This is my first time here. Those of you who don't know, Better Living Through Birding is not a primer on birding entirely. It is a memoir. Birding is woven through it because it's woven through my life. And there are some tips about becoming a birder, but it is a memoir. And one of the things it talks about is my and my family's history of activism. And there was an incident in New York City where an African immigrant was gunned down on his own doorstep. He was guilty of no crime, but undercover police decided that he was a menace and shot him down. And that led to almost sort of a precursor of the kind of protests we saw with George Floyd. So I'm going to start with a passage from the book that begins there. The Coopers descended en masse on one police plaza on a sunny Tuesday, March 23rd. In what was very nearly a next-generation reenactment of the past, Melody marched with my young niece held by one hand while pushing my infant nephew in a stroller with the other. They moved to the sidelines with the children in tow. Melody couldn't risk arrest, as Francis and I took our place in front of police headquarters with 69 others, including Ozzie Davis and Ruby Dee, a black acting couple I'd grown up watching in the movies and whom my father idolized as much for their activism as for their talent. You are advised to clear the area immediately or be subject to arrest, a police sergeant announced through a megaphone, knowing full well from demonstrations yesterday and the day before that none of us would budge. Police officers flanked us with plastic handcuffs at the ready. A moment later, at the sergeant's signal, they moved in. It went down in a very professional manner on the part of both the cops and us protesters. The police certainly had had plenty of practice in the preceding days, and under no circumstances would they be getting rough, not with the celebrity participation and the media glare. As for the protesters, none of us resisted. We wanted to get arrested to keep that media glare exactly where we wanted it, on the inaction since Diallo's death, and the injustices of policing in black and brown communities in general. Cops and protesters had become players in a kabuki dance of civil disobedience, a performance designed to give voice to our outrage and move the needle on police misconduct with a mayor who refused to give an inch. Even knowing this, I still felt an urgent rush of adrenaline as cops cuffed my hands behind my back and led me, Dad, and the others away. The police vans were ready and waiting, one for the men, the other for the women, bound for processing in separate precincts. As the van worked its way uptown, I slipped my relatively supple 35-year-old wrist out of the plastic cuffs, retrieved the peanut M&Ms I'd stashed in my coat pocket, and shared a conspiratorial grin with Dad as I snacked. It would take more than the NYPD's zip-tie restraints to come between this hungry man and his food. Candy finished, I would wriggle back into my cuffs so the cops would be none the wiser, though I'd leave the wrapper for them to find on the van floor, a small token from the unbowed. Surveying the van's dingy holding area, I saw almost exclusively brown skin crowned with gray, if there was any hair left atop at all. Conversation was light, the men mostly quiet. But that would change, and my father with it. After our group was locked in a holding cell at the Uptown precinct to await processing, one of those aging arrestees began to sing. It was some traditional spiritual, and for the life of me, I couldn't say now which one it was, but that was all Francis had to hear. His eyes lit with a fire that was older than I was, and the voice that had sung in many a choir soared. I watched my dad transform into the man he must have been in his 20s, transported back to the civil rights days when he was always getting into good trouble. I watched it happen to all those graying activists as they sang together, and when the song was done, Francis started them up again with another one and another. They took up words that had been sung in protest and struggle for as long as our people had been on American shores, words I didn't know well enough, if at all, to join in. I could only bear witness as the voices of these men filled the entire station house with a righteous sound, resonating through steel bars and brick and mortar. It would be years later, and only once more, that I would find myself in the midst of a sound of such transcendence. Late in the spring migration one year in Central Park, Roger Pasquier, our friend Jared, and I all wandered into a clearing in the Ramble to find a mixed flock of warblers. Males in their finest, black pole warblers in sharp charcoal lines, Cape May warblers in tiger stripes and crimson cheeks, bay-breasted warblers in rich tones of earth and clay, an American redstart colored as if for Halloween in May, and a Blackburnian warbler whose throat glowed as if it were ablaze, each hailing from a species with one of the highest-pitched voices of North American songbirds. And they were singing. They were singing as if with each phrase they were upping the ante, as if we'd stumbled upon some insane warbler sing-off of sing-offs, a battle of finalists to see who could go louder, stronger, higher. They came down from the upper branches to where we didn't even need binoculars, jumping into the judging stands to make their point, their little bodies shaking with the raw power that emanated from them. To this day, we have no idea why, no clue as to what factors in that specific time and place pushed these males to proclaim themselves with such fierce urgency. But even Roger, the been there, done that, seen it all Master Yoda of Central Park birders, was paralyzed as we were blasted by waves of sound tuned so high that some human hearing would find it inaudible. The ultrasonic chorus crescendoed in our ears, a moment of revelation, even if we couldn't fully fathom it with our minds. In both those moments, I can only appreciate that I was in the presence of something mighty and listen in awe.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate that selection. I think everybody knows if you've not read the book, hopefully your appetite is whet by that. I really appreciated when you talked about wanting to do that selection. It encapsulates so much of what your story is about. And so I wanted to start, as we start our conversation here, with where you ended. You ended in birds. And so I wonder if you would talk a little bit about your spark bird and tell folks what a spark bird is. Folks will know this bird because it is a bird that is common in our state. And so we'd love for you to tell a little bit about that and how you found your spark bird.
Sure. For those of you who aren't birders, the spark bird is the bird that got you started birding, the bird that you ran into in some situation, and you were like, oh my God, what is that? What's going on here? This exists in my world, and it just draws you into the world of birding. We call that the spark bird. And for me, it was a red-winged blackbird. I put up a bird feeder that I had made in some woodshop class, and filled it up with cracked corn, and all of a sudden I saw these birds coming to the feeder, and I was like, what are these crows with the red patch on the wings? Oh my God, I've discovered a new species of crow, a scientific wonder in my preteen years. And then I found out they were red-winged blackbirds. But that was it. That was what hooked me, and I got drawn down the tunnel with that. And for me, because I grew up on Long Island in New York, when the male red-winged blackbirds come back and that okari sound that they make, that to me is the first sign of spring. Now for you guys down here, I think actually the redwings winter down here. So the redwings that we say goodbye to, they come down here and hang out for a while. So that actually connects us.
It does indeed. They're a beautiful bird. If folks don't know them, it's definitely worth seeing. I've seen them driving, especially through the Delta. They're a gorgeous bird to see outside. So you mentioned this is your first trip to Arkansas. So again, welcome to the natural state. That is our motto. We're so glad to have you.
I'm glad to be here.
And so I wonder, part of what you mentioned, and I know you had some flight delays, so you may not have gotten a chance to get out and see all the kinds of things that you might want to bird around the state, but I wonder what kinds of birds you would like to see if you had the opportunity to do a birding trip here in the state.
That's easy. I'm in Arkansas, you can guess. It would be beyond fabulous if I could come down here and see an ivory-billed woodpecker. For those of you who are not birders, the ivory-billed woodpecker is often called the Lord God bird because in olden days, when people saw one, they would often say, oh my God, because they were so startled. It's huge, the biggest woodpecker we had in North America, and I use the past tense because there is strong suspicion that it's extinct. But if it's still here, it's here in Arkansas. And it is the holy grail of North American birders to find an ivory-billed woodpecker because it would be a monumental find. It would be like, I mentioned one of the pleasures of birding, I call it the seventh pleasure of birding, is the unicorn effect. When a bird that has existed in your imagination suddenly is there in real life, and you're like, the experience, the thrill is just off the charts. This is the ultimate unicorn bird, to see an ivory-billed woodpecker. And to bring back documentation to prove that you've seen an ivory-billed woodpecker. Because nobody's going to take it on faith. And the other thing you have to know is there's a very similar bird, the pileated woodpecker, that is quite common still in the United States. And an amateur or someone not really versed in the differences will easily mistake a pileated for an ivory-billed. Blah, blah, blah. That answers your question, I think.
Well, that was the right answer, right?
Yeah.
And so I will tell you, when I read the book and I saw, and I think it's on the second printed page, it's even before, it's in the Roman numeral sections, even before you get to the Roman numerals, there is a mention of ivory-billed woodpeckers, and I'll just read that quote real quickly. As a black kid in the 1970s, I was rarer than an ivory-billed woodpecker in the very white world of birding. So appreciate your acknowledgement of our favorite bird, whether it's here or not. So thank you for that. So one of the things that you did, as you had your spark bird, and clearly it sparked a real interest for you, and you really got into birds a lot, and you learned a lot, and you became really excellent. I wonder if you would tell a story you talked about early in the book about a bird walk you and your dad took with the South Shore Audubon Society when you were a child. And I wonder if you would share that story.
Sure. My dad saw his bird-crazy son, and he's like, what am I going to do with this? But the good thing is that he himself was a science teacher, a biology teacher, has had a love of nature. So it was not a big leap for him to have a bird-crazy son. So he decided he was going to nurture this, and he found out when the local Audubon chapter, which was the South Shore Audubon Society, when they had a bird walk scheduled, and we went. And, we were the only black people there, but there you go. And so we started the walk, and at one point the walk leader, a guy named Elliot Kuttner, looked at the scope at something, pretty far away, and he goes, "Oh, we've got a pair of American woodcocks here. Everybody come check out the American woodcocks." And, so I trotted up there and looked, and I went back to my dad, and I'm like, "I don't think those are woodcocks." And my dad is like, well, why? He said, "Well, tell him." And I'm like, "I'm not going to tell him." And I'm like, "I'm not going to humiliate myself. What the heck do I know?" But my dad nudged me, and so I finally went up to Elliot, and I'm like, "Excuse me, sir." Like Oliver Twist asking for more gruel, I don't think those are American woodcocks. And Elliot, who had this big personality, is like, "Why don't you think those are American woodcocks?" And I'm like, "Because the pattern on the head is more like stripes like a bicycle helmet. I think they might be snipe." And Elliot looks in the scope. And, I had these ridiculously young, useful eyes. And he goes, "You're right, everybody. This young man is just pointing out that these are Wilson snipe. Everybody come look at the Wilson." And he's just like, and his eyes are on fire. And he's like, "This one's mine." So, and he became my birding mentor for many, many years. Elliot really did sort of feed that passion.
It's a really excellent story. And part of what I really like about it is that you clearly had demonstrated excellence in birding, right? You had that confidence. Your dad knew it, and that's why he was like, "Go tell him." I mean, if he's wrong, he's just wrong. And so I wonder if you could talk about how that commitment to excellence, to really getting to know something really well, to be excellent at it, and that combined with confidence, how that has influenced the kinds of ways you approach problems.
It's funny you should say that. I don't think of it as sort of a dedication to excellence, as just sort of curiosity. I want to know more, and I wanna be able to tell these birds apart. And so you learn what you can, and then you learn more, and you learn from other people, and you learn from, whatever guides you can learn from, and you just keep trying to add more information. I can't say I ever set out for excellence in birding. And, even though the name of my TV show is Extraordinary Birder, I'm like, first of all, I didn't pick the name. Second of all, the show. But second of all, I know the extraordinary birders. I've met them. They're not me. I have my skills. I'm a good birder. But, I've met the ones who are truly extraordinary. So it's not so much, trying to be the ultimate as just enjoying it and wanting to do more and wanting to learn more. And that's the passion for me.
It's really excellent. I appreciate you sharing that in that context. I think, as you think about that passion, and I think all of us can clearly hear that, and when you read the book, you can clearly read that in the book. And I think about that when I read, as you talked about Memorial Day 2020, right? And, it was early in the pre-vaccine COVID pandemic, late in the spring migration season. But still, despite those two things, you biked out to Central Park pulled out your binoculars, and as you wrote, you dug into the day to see what treasures it might bring, right? That's the passion, that's the anticipation, that's the hope, that's the excitement that you bring to it.
Especially during spring migration. I mean, it turns every morning into a treasure hunt. It is so much fun.
And so imagine that level of fun, right? You're up in the early morning, you're ready to see this stuff, and can you tell us what happened on that day?
Yeah. I was just about to call it quits when I hear, "Henry! Henry!" Someone calling at the top of their lungs, a human name, but no one would talk to a human like that. So, without even seeing what's going on, I knew it was a dog off the leash in the Ramble. And you have to understand, the Ramble is a protected part of Central Park. There is signage everywhere saying dogs must be on the leash at all times, and that's because the habitat is fragile. And I don't know if you've ever been to a dog run, but the next time you are, see if anything grows there. So that's what we don't want to have happen to the Ramble. And the problem with a place like Central Park, like Prospect Park in Brooklyn, is that the density of population is so great, the usage is so great, so that if people all let their dogs run off the leash, the entire place would be torn up because there's so many people, so many dogs. So to protect the wildlife in there are coyote in there are raccoons in there. We used to have ring-necked pheasants that nested in the middle of Manhattan in the Ramble. Off-leash dogs killed them. And that was a big turning point for me. After that, I'm like, no, I'm not going to stand by and say nothing. I'm going to say something when this thing happens. So So finally, I waited until she was right by the sign, because I'm like, yeah, you know, it always helps to have the sign there. And I said, ma'am, dogs in the ramble have to be on the leash at all times. Sign's right there. And she just wasn't having it. You know, she was going to do what she wanted to do, and it devolved from there because neither of us was going to give an inch. And I come prepared. After 35 years of birding the ramble, you know, I come prepared for this. She was not prepared. She kind of unraveled when someone was not going to just let her do what she wanted without some pushback. And then she took it, because, you know, conflict between birders and dog walkers is the second oldest story in the ramble. But she took it to another place, and she made it racial. And that's why it went viral, and that's why it became so noteworthy. And it particularly became noteworthy, and this is why I don't focus on her, because she's a distraction. What matters is the racial bias that she tapped into without even thinking. It was just another weapon she reached for to use in our conflict. That's the important part to recognize, because later that same day, that racial bias in Minneapolis made a white police officer think it was okay to kneel on a black man's neck until he was dead, and made a bunch of other police officers there stand around and do nothing. That's the racial bias we have to fight against. It's the same racial bias that makes the Supreme Court think, oh, well, you know, affirmative action, what do we need that for? It's all okay now, and roll it back. That's the racial bias we have to focus on. That's what we have to fight against. Don't be distracted. Keep your eyes on the prize.
I so appreciate the way that you frame that story, because I think it does. It keeps your eyes on the prize. It keeps the focus where it needs to be. And you mentioned in the reading your your family's commitment to social justice, the work that you all have done in civil rights movement and promoting racial justice. And I wonder, it seems like a lot of that prepared you for that, to be able to respond for that. I know you've talked in other places about what was in your mind when you decided to record, and when you decided to keep recording. I wonder if you would share that a little bit as well, because I think it helps connect some unfortunate incidents and helps tell that story.
Sure. It's interesting. There's a big difference between why I decided to record and why I decided to keep recording. I decided to record because she was stroking her dog. I had pulled out dog treats to try to tempt the dog out of a restricted area, out of the shrubs. I hadn't even had a chance to throw any, and as soon as she saw the treats come out, because like I say, I come prepared, and as soon as I pulled the treats out, she lost it. That was the beginning of her downward spiral. And instead of doing the logical thing, which is, a dog's gonna eat treats because a dog's a dog. So if you don't want your dog to be eating the treats, you put it on the leash. That's the desired response. That's not what she did. She picked it up, and she's like, with the poor dog. I'm like, well, that's not the idea. First of all, she's hurting the dog. And second of all, the second she puts the dog down, it's going to be off the leash again. So I'm like, all right, this is not working. Switch to a different tactic. So I did what a lot of us in the park had been doing, which is we were recording the leash scofflaws and recording the behavior. And so that's the reason why I started recording. A lot of people think, I started recording because I wanted to catch the racial incident. It hadn't even gone racial yet. I had no idea where this was going to go at that point. I was just recording as another strategy to get her to leash the dog. And that pissed her off more than anything else. I think if I hadn't been recording, maybe the whole thing wouldn't have happened, because it made her super angry. And she wanted me to stop. And she lunged at me a couple of times, you can see in the video, to try to get me to stop. And I'm like, please don't come close to me. Please don't come close to me, because it was COVID. We were supposed to keep 6 feet distance. And finally, she made her racialized threat as an attempt to intimidate me. And I say that because it's funny, some right-wing people were like, well, she was just describing him, the race thing was just describing to the police. She wasn't talking to the police at that point. She was talking to me. She says, I'm going to tell the police that an African-American man is threatening my life. That was meant to intimidate me into not recording, and that's when I had a choice to make. And at that moment, my mind went to Philando Castile. And again, here we have to go to Minneapolis again, sadly. Philando Castile was an ordinary worker in a cafeteria for kids in the schools, driving home from the county fair with his girlfriend next to him and his girlfriend's, I think she was maybe like 8 or 10 years old in the back seat. And he got pulled over by a cop for a traffic infraction. He did all the things that black mothers tell their sons they're supposed to do in a confrontation with police. He was respectful. He kept his hands on the steering wheel. He volunteered to the cop. I just want you to know, sir, that I have a handgun in the car. I am licensed to carry. It is permitted. And he still ended up shot dead in front with his girlfriend next to him and that little child in the back watching the whole thing. And when that happened, I remember when that happened, my mind kept going through, well, what would I have done to have a different outcome? And there was nothing. There was nothing any black person could have done to have a different outcome. And that was the point at which I decided, you know what? They're going to shoot us dead no matter what we do. And if that's the case, I'm going to go out with my dignity intact. And that was what I thought when she made her threat. Because for a split second, I was like, all right, maybe if I stop recording, this can all go away. Because I'm not an idiot. I've grown up in the United States as a black man my whole life. I know what it means to have a white woman, sort of to say that you're doing something wrong. More than likely, you're not the one who's going to be believed. So I'm like, how do I save myself? Do I just stop? And I'm like, you know what? I'm not going to make this easier for her. I am not going to be complicit in my own dehumanization. I am going to keep recording, whether as I would have done, whether I was white, black, Asian, blue, or brown, until that dog is on the leash, and she's just going to have to do what she feels she needs to do. And that's what happened. So, when you ask, so the decision to record, that was one thing. But the decision to keep recording, that was sort of the fulcrum of my decision-making. And so that's what I decided to do.
I think I appreciate, I wanted you to tell that story because I think it's important to understand how history informs our decisions and how having a conscious mind about the things that are going on can help us make decisions in the split second sometimes that we need to make them. So thank you for sharing that. To turn a little bit, you wrote for Marvel Comics for years and were on the team when the Alpha Flight character North Star came out. Later, you created Marvel's first openly lesbian character, Victoria Montesi. And so I wonder if you could talk about how you were able to position yourself within Marvel to do these things, to do these first.
The answer is I didn't. The answer is I didn't. I just was telling stories. And when you tell stories, you tell what you know. And I'm an openly gay person. I know lesbians, I know gay people, I know all kinds of people. In fact, one of the characters in that comic book that Victoria Montesi is in, Darkhold, is modeled on my grandmother. And, you don't put an elderly black woman as a lead character in a comic book. You just don't do that. You're supposed to, if you put in a woman at all, it's supposed to be some, skin-tight babe in some outfit. And I put an elderly because that's my grandmother. I'm like, she's tough as nails. She would kick butt in these situations. So, I was just writing what I know. But, I think that speaks to how it's important to have all kinds of people included in all fields, because we will bring different perspectives and we will show different things. And it's important for people to see that, whether they are part of that. If you're part of that group, you want to see yourself. And if you're not part of that group, it gives you maybe a little insight into that other group. So it wasn't any sort of, intention of, I must do this first. Maybe a little bit with the Star Trek character. Because I did introduce Star Trek's first openly gay human character, and that was a little bit more intentional. Because I'm a big Trekker, huge Trekker. Mr. Spock, I'm all about Mr. Spock. That was actually my default in that situation in Central Park, because my stress levels were going through the roof, and I'm like, okay, you cannot respond to this emotionally. You've got to go back to your Spock-like rational approach to everything. And that's what I did. I was like, I got to be rational here. But Star Trek shows the distant utopian future, and then gay people are completely absent. I'm like, no. we will be there. And so I wrote in that one character, and it was tremendous fun. And yeah, it had a mixed reaction. You know, some people were like, what are you doing in Star Trek? And other people were like, thank God, finally. So.
Yeah, it's excellent. I appreciate your sort of noting how people need to. It's important for everybody to see that. I think sometimes people think it's only for the group that's in question, but it is for all of us. We all need to be able to see folks. And I want to turn to a section in your book where you write about your teen years. And I'm going to read just an excerpt from that. You say, you felt that, quote, the real me spent that dozen-year eternity buried alive. I felt as if I were locked inside a coffin under 6 feet of earth, in utter darkness, slowly suffocating. I pounded on the inside of the lid, desperate for someone to let me out, but no one could hear my screams. No one knew there was someone alive down there. Friends and family walked over my grave, oblivious. And I read that, you know, you can get a sense of that from just a couple sentences, but I wanted to read more of it because I feel like, you know, there's some teenager, there's some adult, maybe in this room, who understands what that feels like. And I wonder if you could share a bit of what brought you solace. And I think you alluded to it earlier, but I wonder if you'd share a bit of what brought you solace, what allowed you to help cope during that period of time that eventually led to you being able to do the kinds of things you just described at Marvel Comics and elsewhere.
Sure. I mean, one of my big escapes was birding. And it is, you know, not just a tonic if you're queer and in the closet. I think it's a tonic for anybody who has any kind of woe. Because it gets you outside of your own head, I think in a way more than, say, something like hiking does. Because, you know, hiking or being out in nature in general is a tremendously restorative thing. But birding in particular, if you want to see the birds, you can't be rolling around in your head about whatever the problem is. You've got to turn your focus with intention to the world around you, and you've got to be listening for the sounds. You've got to be looking for a particular kind of motion that'll let you lock on to the bird. And once you do that, you're engaging with the world beyond you, and you're getting outside of your own head, and at least for a little while, those problems fall away. So that's why I think it is so important, so great for so many people to go birding, and it certainly was great for me as a teenager. And when that I couldn't bird 24/7. But what also helped me was I would escape into worlds of fantasy and illusion. I mean, my whole family is science fiction addicts, and as am I. And going to the movies and losing myself in somebody else's reality. Karama will confirm that I walked through the lobby and smelled popcorn. And I was like, I need some now, because it's a Pavlovian for me. Popcorn is salt and butter and sitting in the dark and losing yourself in someone else's reality. And that was another way that I sort of escaped the closet for a little while. When Star Wars came out, it literally saved my life, because I was, I think, 13 or 14 at the time, and I was ready to kill myself. Because I had this deep, dark secret, and life was hell. And then Star Wars came. And I would sit in the movie theater, and I would watch 3 showings of Star Wars in a row and just not leave the movie theater and just lose myself in George Lucas's reality. Thank you, George Lucas. You saved my life, literally. So that's another way I escaped. I'm not sure if that takes you to where you wanted to be.
No, it takes me exactly. I mean, I wanted you to share that because I think it's important for people to know how all of these tools can be such important tools for us, right? And I think, you know, the title of the book is Better Living, right? And I think, you know, that you really speak to that in there.
Well, I think for so many people, you know, their escape ended up being drugs or alcohol and you know, those destructive paths. And that's unfortunate because they often pay a price for that, sometimes for their whole lives. I happily was able to miss those traps. I think it's one of the reasons why I'm kind of a generally upbeat, happy person now, is because I lived through that, what really felt like an eternity of hell, and when it finally ended, I was like, you know what? I've lived through that. Life is good.
It's a real important story to tell, right? It's important for folks to know that. So thank you for sharing that. I wanted to turn to, in Arkansas, we are getting ready to be in the path of totality for the upcoming eclipse on April 8th. I see some folks rubbing their hands. I'm very excited about this, too. This has been on my calendar for years. April 8th, 2024, put it on your calendar. And so we hope that you'll come back for that eclipse.
I have bad news. I have already booked a place in Mazatlan, Mexico. Sorry. It's the day before my birthday, and my 60th birthday has passed, but I deliberately kept it low-key because I'm like, no, 61 is going to be the big one with the eclipse. So
Understood. Well, we'll give you that. But that just means you have to come back to Arkansas another time.
okay, to find the Lord God bird.
For the Lord God bird, exactly, and other purposes as well. So I mentioned eclipses, though, because you mentioned in your book that you've seen 2 eclipses, 2 total eclipses, both with your dad. And I wonder if you would describe that second trip, that most recent trip with your dad, and what that trip meant to you.
Oh, it was really huge because my dad had taken me to see my first solar eclipse when I was very young, because it was the early 70s. It's the total eclipse that Carly Simon sings about in that song, You're So Vain, to see the total eclipse of the sun. Well, my dad and I went to Nova Scotia to see the total eclipse of the sun. And it was startling. And it was one of the times in my early life when my dad and I bonded, because we were both science nerds, and we were both like, this is awesome to see the sky turn to night in the middle of the day. So when the total solar eclipse hit again, what year was it? It was recently. It was
17, 16?
2017, thank you. 2017, and my dad called me up and he goes, there's a total solar eclipse. I'm like, I know, but we're too late. Everything will be booked. He's like, well, we could try. And I'm like, we could go. And then he's like, all right, I'll call you back. And he booked like the last place that was still available in Nashville, which was some moldering drive-through motel on the outskirts of town. It was really seedy, but we got a place, so we went. And it was really important because it was sort of coming full circle with my dad, and I didn't know it at the time, but it was the last trip he and I would take together. So, as we had done when I was a little kid, we took this trip, and we stood in the parking lot of this seedy motel, and we looked up at the sky, and we watched day turn to night, and it was incredible. I had seen a total solar eclipse before, so I thought I was prepared, and I just stared up the sky, and I just couldn't help myself. I just said, "Oh my God!" And I'm a tree-hugging pagan, so I was just. But you just look up in the sky, and you are just filled with wonder, because it's almost the opposite of the unicorn effect, when something mythological has come to life. This is something that you always take for granted, that is ordinary, that is suddenly transformed into something extraordinary, and you will get to experience it in 2024.
Yeah, thank you for that. I was hoping you'd share that, because it made me so excited. I've not seen one yet, so this doesn't.
Oh, you're in for a treat.
I know, I'm so excited. So appreciate you sharing that. So as you talk, and you mentioned the 7 pleasures of birding earlier. One of them, number 2, is beauty in the natural setting, and one of the things that you mentioned is that birds are not they're not always in what would be stereotypically a natural setting, right? I mean, sounds like the majority of your birding in Central Park in New York City, right? And that doesn't.
Well, no, I was just going to say, people think, cities are not part of nature. They are a special case. They are an extremely man-made, modified case. But you know what? When a beaver builds a dam, they're modifying the environment too. So this is just a more extreme case of an animal modifying the environment, but it is still part of nature. New York City sits directly on the Atlantic Flyway, so during migration, the birds pass through. So yeah, cities are very much a part of the natural world. In fact, the more we recognize that, I think the more we can help the natural world to thrive in our cities by planting native plants and doing other things that help the bugs and the birds.
Well, I wanted to actually turn exactly to that. So earlier this month, we, of course, commemorated the anniversary of the September 11th attacks. And many of you have seen, probably in the media or maybe in person, the tribute in light, as it's called, the 2 large beams of light that shine each evening each year on the evening of September 11th. And I wonder if you could talk about those lights and what they meant for the birds. You just said, I mean, it's a major flyway, and so.
Sure, and the thing about September 11th is that it happened at the peak of the fall songbird migration. In fact, I don't bird the fall as relentlessly as I bird the spring, but I happened to be birding that morning when it all happened. So in the aftermath, I think it was the next year or maybe 2 years later, they did this really incredible tribute where they took the footprint of the two fallen towers and they got an array of lights that shoot the beams up into the sky so that the towers are kind of recreated as beams that soar all the way up and disappear into the heavens. And it was really moving for all of us New Yorkers, and it's beautiful. But it happens right because September 11th happened during the peak of the fall songbird migration. It happens right at the peak of the fall songbird migration every year. And a lot of the songbirds migrate at night because it's cooler, they use the stars to navigate, etc. And powerful light sources can disorient them. So what was happening is that the birds at this peak of the migration were getting trapped in the lights from the tribute in light and potentially dying by the thousands. So you have this thing that is meant to be an elegy, a tribute to the fallen, and it's just turning into another killer. A full disclosure, I'm a board member of New York City Audubon, though I was not at the time that this went down. But, New York City Audubon was gearing up to go to war over this. But, how do you go to war over something that is so emotional and so important to people? Instead of going to war, what they did was they went to the people who do the tribute in light, and they worked out a compromise solution. And what happens now every year is that volunteers from New York City Audubon, when the tribute in light is going, they stay up all night and they monitor the density of the birds in the lights. They count how many birds are in it. And when it reaches a certain density that the birds are getting trapped, they turn off the lights for 20 minutes so that the birds can disperse, and then they turn them back on. And it was such a wonderful thing to see come out of 9/11 that, instead of going to war, instead of having conflict, these two sides found a way to make it work for everybody and keep that tribute going. So that's, one of the few good things to come out of 9/11.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. So, indeed. So we will say we'll have some time for questions. I'm going to ask one more question, and so ask the audience if you all have questions to get those ready. We have two microphones. We'll have those in just a moment. But I wanted to ask one more question before I turn to the audience. So as I mentioned, we're the natural state, right? And so we have a lot of folks, people who are residents, people who are visitors, who come to hike and camp and fish and canoe and climb and otherwise enjoy the outdoors. And I wonder if you could talk about if there are particular things you might say to try to convert them to birding or add on to birding. I'm asking for a friend, so just...
The whole thing about birding is you just look and you listen. And you just try to pay attention with intention to your surroundings and see what you see what you find. And it can transform a hike. I try not to go hiking with people who aren't birders unless I'm leaving the binoculars behind, because you will drive them crazy. Because you'll be stopping every 10 feet. Oh, I heard something. I want to find it. And they're like, we are trying to get to the top of this trail. But you can do it, in those circumstances. If you're homebound, you can go to the window and look out the window and see what birds come to there. If you are blind, you can listen for the birds. And in Extraordinary Birder, and this is one of the extraordinary birders who give the show its title, in the Puerto Rico episode, there is a blind birder who sorts all the birds strictly by sound. And I consider myself a near birder. I process the sounds, but he really processes the sounds to the point that they are using him to tell them what is in their forest, because they can't have people observing the forest 24/7, but they can have a machine recording the sounds 24/7, and then they bring him in. And he listens to the sounds, and he tells them everything that's in their forest, sorting through the sounds, because he's blind and relies entirely on his ears. So I don't care if you are an undocumented person. The birds don't care. The house finch, a lot of us are very familiar with it. The little sparrow-sized finch with a kind of raspberry-colored head. Its scientific name is Carpodicus mexicanus. It's from the desert Southwest. It was introduced here in the East. It crosses back and forth in the Southwest between Mexico and Arizona and Texas and does not give a damn. So if you are, all these birds that migrate, they transit the world, they recognize no borders. The birds do not care if you are black, white, Latino, Asian, indigenous, queer, straight, transgender, they do not care. So this is why I always say, the birds belong to none of us, but they are for all of us to enjoy. So that's, I think, what you really have to focus on when you go out looking for birds.
Well, thank you so much. And the book has tips for birders as well. It's not only tips, but it does have some good tips. I've downloaded a couple things, and
Lots of mnemonics for the bird songs.
Yeah. So if there are folks who have questions, as I said, there are 2 microphones there. Please.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm so happy that you came to Arkansas, and I'm just so pleased. Thank you for coming here.
My pleasure, really.
I'm so excited that you're here because I feel like I've watched you from that very first sort of faded viral moment that was a very terrible, like unpleasant thing, but it has been the springboard for so many things for you coming into the spotlight in the birding world. And the book and the show, everything, I'm just really happy for you, first of all.
Thanks. I will say this, which is that I know for a lot of people looking at it, sort of my existence starts with that viral moment.
I know.
But one of the things I like about the book is it lets me put it into context. And what you find out is that, for me in my life, that comes late and is not all that significant. But what it did do is all the things I've sort of worked for previously, which is, to summarize it in a quick catchphrase, justice for black people, equality for queer people, and the joy of wild birds for all people. But I've been doing that for years, but now what I get to do is I get to do it to a bigger audience, on a bigger platform, and that I am grateful for.
Yes, and that was my intention with that comment, yes. But you had an entire life before that moment, but it brought you into my knowing. But I have a birding question for you.
Sure.
I've been birding for about 2 to 3 years, just casually.
Did you start with the pandemic?
That's funny. It didn't have to do with the pandemic, no.
Okay.
I couldn't even say what started it, funny enough. I probably saw a cute bird, and it started from there.
You're a spark bird.
I need to figure out what that was. I need to go back and look. But I use the Merlin Bird ID like many birders, and I have a question for you. I don't know if you even use that app, but if you can hear a bird by sound or you identify it by sound, do you really count that? Because to me, I only want to count it if I put my eyes on it.
Okay.
And sort of a follow-up question is just, how can I go from hearing it to seeing it?
It is a really good question. The answer is, if you hear it, yes, it does count. Now, here's the caveat, which is that your ears can fool you. For example, I just heard a red-tailed hawk. I'm so excited. Actually, what you heard was a blue jay imitating a red-tailed hawk, because they will do that. And then you're shaking your fist at the damn blue jay. You can be fooled. That's why I prefer to get sort of visual confirmation. There are some birds at this point that, I know them so well, I'm like, yeah, I know what that is. And I don't even question it. And in fact, when people do, for example, breeding bird surveys, where they're going through an area to figure out if birds are breeding there, they do it almost entirely by sound. It's what they hear in different places that lets them identify whether or not the birds are breeding there. But it does count. You just want to be careful, especially if you're relatively new, use Merlin to confirm. And Merlin is amazing. I hate it because it makes me obsolete. But it is an incredible use of AI and is still learning. It is still getting better. It's not foolproof, but it keeps getting better and better. And full disclosure, I'm on the board of the Cornell Lab of Ornithology that puts out Merlin. So Cornell Lab does amazing stuff, and Merlin has opened so many people who weren't birders before to birding. So it's really a good thing, as much as I may despise it.
Thank you so much.
We'll go over here.
Before you leave Arkansas. Will you be doing an episode for Extraordinary for the show?
Unfortunately, no. I wish. We've talked, and don't hold me to this because I don't make all the decisions about the show, but we have talked about doing an episode specifically in search of the Ivory Belt. And if we found it, oh my God. That's why they call it the Lord God bird. But unfortunately, no. Right now, we don't even know if we're going to get a second season. We're waiting to find out from National Geographic. Shameless plug, they're waiting to see how many people stream it on Disney+.
Excellent. Thank you. We'll come over here now.
Thank you on so many levels. First off, fellow Trekkie, and I used to watch it before it was a rerun, if that tells you anything. So I could talk to you for hours, listen to you for hours, but I have a question that's just, it's no pressure, but you have such an impressive story for the youth. Are you taking the birding in some way that this could go into the schools or something? It feels really powerful.
Well, thank you. I have thought about sort of doing somehow maybe a kid's version of Better Living Through Birding, because it's not really a kid's book. It's got, and nothing explicit, but it's frank. It's about an adult's life. What I do is, and I've been doing it, again, I say, I've been doing this stuff for years, for like 35 years, I've been going to the New York City public schools to talk to kids about birds and get them outside of the classroom and away from, the devices and the pixels and the screens and into, again, the nature that's near them, whether it's a park or whatever green space is nearby, even in a city, and getting them to look at birds and understand birds and appreciate birds. And so that's a great joy to do that. And I could tell you so many stories. I put, I think, one kid story in the book, mostly because I don't like to, kids are kids, don't drag them into, I don't like to put them in a place where they are, somehow revealed or exposed. But I could tell you stories, some amazing stories of some of the stuff that has happened with kids.
Well, thank you. I think it's an incredible opportunity that it could impact kids and get them into a positive attitude about the environment and saving birds.
No, for sure.
And speaking of which, the second question, I'll just make it really short, is with the habitat loss, is there any work within Audubon? I am an Audubonner here, but I haven't heard anything to this effect of saving the habitat, because like out in my area right now, I just get sick at my stomach because the trees are going. So I just wondered if there's any sort of an environmentally inclusive thing.
Tons of organizations are working, including Audubon, including the Nature Conservancy, including Conservation International. They're all working on habitat protection. You know what? We don't have to wait for them. We can do it ourselves. If you have a yard, you can plant native plants. And in fact, there is an organization called Homegrown National Parks. And it's called that because the idea is to get all of us to turn whatever space we have into a space that is welcoming to wildlife by planting important native plants in whatever space we have. If you're in New York City and you've got a fire escape, put a plant out there with some, echinacea growing in it so that some butterflies have something to feed on that's native. If you've got a backyard, plant some native trees. So, I encourage everyone to look up homegrownnationalpark.org. It's a great organization, and what I love about it is us doing it. We're not waiting for the government. We're not waiting for some organizations to do it for us. We are doing it ourselves, and I love that.
Absolutely.
Excellent. Thank you.
And so when, oh, okay, great.
Thank you for the Arkansas Wild Spaces.
Yeah, I just want to throw something out there, crowdsourcing, buying up some property.
So thank you. I know we probably have time for just maybe one, maybe two more questions, depending on. So we'll start here and we'll see how far we get.
I'm gonna get quick so we can get one in. You mentioned the Ramble. You mentioned Central Park, like this green space in the middle of the largest city in the country, and then that had me thinking about Eastern Arkansas, where you basically drive 110 miles from here to Memphis, and you're like, this is really flat. But it's also the Mississippi Flyway, and it's some of the best birding in United States, North America, and it's also been crafted by human civilization for thousands of years, and especially the last 200 years. How would you like us to think about this place where I can drive and count hawks on each almost fence post? Like, how would you like us to think about that humanized birding landscape that still sort of remains somewhat intact?
I think you're already there. You're thinking of it as a human-influenced space that can still provide an incredible resource to our relatives who are traveling with us on this planet. For the birds and the other animals and for the bugs. That's the way to look at it. That it is, it may be human influence, but that doesn't mean it can't also be for everybody else who shares this planet with us. So I think you're already there.
So one more quick question.
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, thank you so much for this book, and thank you for giving all of the local birders a reason to talk more about birding with our friends here. As you know, one of the joys of birding is the fact that this practice evolves individually over the course of our lives, and I'm just curious, you talked about the curiosity that brought you into this. Where is your curiosity bringing you in your birding practice today, and has your access to this platform changed the way that you bird?
Wow, really good questions. Darn. How has it changed? Where do I see my birding going? Here's a good example. I don't know if this is a big trend or just a temporary trend, but I am a devotee of Central Park and birding there. But Central Park is actually quite a ways from my apartment. And there is a micro park that's around the corner from my apartment. And whereas I will still do Central Park and only Central Park in the spring, but now in the fall, this fall in particular, what I find myself doing is instead of going all the way to Central Park and making that commitment and basically having to devote the whole morning, I will go to the little micro park for just like an hour and see what I can find there. And just, it's almost like a casual walk through, and whatever I find, I find. And I like that because it keeps me, immersed in birding, but in a much easier way. So that's one direction I'm going in. And your other question is where I think...
You talked about the access that you have to this platform.
Oh, yes, how
has
that
changed
has it changed? Sure, and I'll tell you one way. I'm the stereotypical New Yorker in that I don't drive. So there are a lot of places to go birding in this country where, you basically have to drive to get there. And now all of a sudden these people from National Geographic are saying, oh, okay, well, can we take you to these places you wouldn't be able to get to otherwise to go look at some birds and tell people about it? And I'm like, if I must, So, yeah, and now, if we get a second season, we're hoping to go international, and then, they're talking about going to Portugal, we're going to New Zealand, and I'm like, oh. And then this December, I'm going to be on a Lindblad cruise to Antarctica. I know. The last continent I haven't seen yet, and, we're talking penguins, we're talking skuas, we're talking snow petrels, and cetaceans, southern right whales, orcas. I'm there, so...
I'm ready for the eclipse episode in Mexico of your target bird list down there.
That's just going to be one big birthday party. So.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Christian. This has been truly a pleasure. It's been a pleasure for me. I know it's been a pleasure for our audience. I know we didn't quite get to all the questions, but Christian will be signing books. And so as we wrap up, and we'll lead him out to do that in just a moment. Again, I want to thank our sponsors, the Rebsamen Fund, the Alan Ross Company Memorial Fund, and Wild Birds Unlimited. I want to encourage you all to complete the festival evaluations. They're just outside. Also, the Classic in Context ballots. So this year, it's... for colored girls who've considered suicide when the rainbow is enough. I was in that play when I was in college, really fun. So looking forward to that discussion tomorrow, but there's voting that's happening for the Six Bridges Book Festival next year, and which book will be considered there, so please vote for that. And again, encourage you to engage in the rest of the festival because it continues through tomorrow. So again, please join me in thanking Christian Cooper. Thank you.